I don't know about you, if you've been waiting for this, but I certainly have. With a degree, I should say, of awareness that probably the kind of things I'm going to be saying are things that you often say to yourself and with other colleagues. But what I'd like to do is to really ask about whether your organizations are really fit for the future. Because unless you can answer a positive yes, then I think we're all in trouble. But let me start off with a little, if you like, scenario. And it goes like this. There's a place called the Fergana Valley. And it's in Central Asia, formed by Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, and Kazakhstan. But the year is 2035. And extraordinarily, in a sense, one returns to Marco Polo. This area has now become a thriving area, in part because of its tremendous agricultural capacity, and in part because of an industrial development. Now, with all of that said, the whole system, for the sake of this scenario, depends upon a massive dam within that valley. And the dam provides both electricity for the region and for all the towns, the industrial towns in the Fergana Valley, smart towns as they're now called. And it also provides water for agriculture. Now these are very sensitive systems. And now what is going to happen is that we have a problem emerging with that dam. That dam is controlled in a totally cybernetic way. The systems that allow the sluices to open depend upon a whole cybernetic system. The control of that whole dam, all the electricity depends upon that cybernetic system. But somewhere above the ionosphere, a small particle now has destroyed one of the critical satellites that provides that cybernetic linkage. The sluices which had been opened now can't be closed. We're now starting with a flood. The electricity that was needed for these smart towns are not available. But worse than that is that now, because of this flood, all these sorts of nuclear material that the Soviets had buried in this area during the Cold War period now are exposed. We now have nuclear tailings emerging, so we have no electricity to drive, if you like, the smart towns. We have floods where the agricultural production should have been, and now we have nuclear tailings. Impossible? Why are we talking about this? And the answer is, no, it's not impossible. And what I'd like you to do is to perhaps think about the following questions. I just wondered, if you take a look at these, to what extent do you give thinking and do you think about the what might be's? To what extent do you think about the future? How much space and time do you give? Is it an add-on, or do you not do it at all? Is it not really very practical? Or is it one of these things where you leave a workshop and you say, oh God, wasn't that fantastic? I had a moment to think before I returned to my real job. So my question is, what actually happens if you fail to start thinking speculatively, systematically about the future? Thank you. What I'd like to do is cover territory that you probably know very, very well. But let me just quickly summarize what I think are the changing nature of humanitarian crises. What you see is future crises in a global context. And then really the core of what I am interested in, for I think all our sakes, is the question of what does the humanitarian organization of the 21st century look like? Let me start with, what kind of crises might we have to deal with? I left you with nuclear tailings coming out of Central Asia. These are now being picked up by winds that are, if you like, driving these tailings to all parts, but particularly here to Northern Europe, Sweden, Norway, Denmark, etc. These are something which, if you like, has occurred because of the way that, in a sense, the environment was treated. We buried what seemed to be, if you like, products, or if you like, the nuclear elements that were boxed in sufficiently well that they could never escape. But a combination of climate change, a combination of the erosion of these containers which contain nuclear waste began to erode, and here you are with nuclear tailings. Here you are with a burgeoning economy in West Africa, where oil now is increasingly found, where industries now are taking off, where there's a rising economy, but no one is taking a look at what happens with spills, oil spills on the west coast of Africa. What are the consequences to the urban environment? What are the consequences, and how does this flow over to other borders? So basically, the types of disasters, I think, are going to become far more interactive between the technological and the natural hazards, a point which I know you've gone over. But let me then add this. Let's talk about the dimensions of disasters. We're talking, and I know that Rudolph just mentioned this issue of regional, but more and more these impacts are global. How is this going to affect the global system? No longer is it just cross-border, but isn't it even fascinating how little discussion, how little consultation has gone on cross-border? When we talk about prevention, preparedness, we talk essentially about the countries. You go to ECOWAS, and ECOWAS, the Economic Commission of West African States, talks about what we are doing in terms of preparedness within the countries of ECOWAS. But nobody talks about what are we doing about preparedness across the borders. So dimensions in and of themselves are not being focused on adequately. But let me talk about the dynamics. All of a sudden, you have a complete shutdown, a complete cybernetic failure. And here you can say, well, a cybernetic failure really only affects a few countries that are cybernetically dependent. And that answer is, there are very few countries that are not cybernetically dependent. We take and are awed by the social networking phenomenon, the crowdsourcing phenomenon, the crowdfunding phenomenon. But we're not really preparing for the consequences of a complete failure of that throughout the world. We talk about cyber terrorism, but that's different. Cybernetic failure that could cause a global collapse across key industries will then also impact upon the environment and certainly expose extraordinary human vulnerability. There are also issues of simultaneous consequences. It's interesting, if you take a look at planners within the humanitarian sector, that if there is long-term planning, and there really rarely is, how rarely does this issue of how do I deal with events that happen almost simultaneously? We now have a huge tsunami in, let's say, the Far East. At the same time, we have a major drought in the Horn of Africa. And all of a sudden, it finally has happened. That San Francisco earthquake, that West Coast earthquake has finally occurred, all within the same time. How do you deal with it? Who's thinking about it? What and how do you actually respond? So what I'd like to do is say, well, you know, part of the response is made difficult for a variety of reasons. And again, I know you've touched on some of these, but let me just review these with you, just to be sure that, in a sense, we're working from a common platform. I think if you take a look at the fundamental change that I've seen in humanitarian issues, it is that humanitarian crises, environmental crises, increasingly become and are core to political and to governmental security in two senses. In some countries, failure to respond will mean that you're just not there for the next election. In other countries, if you fail to respond, riots on the streets will mean that your government's not there at all. But one way or another, more and more governments depend and understand that they depend upon the way they are seen to respond to these crises. And that is new in terms of its intensity. What one also talks about is the emerging, if you like, BRICS, the new actors, the issues of the rising Southeast Asian nations, Latin America, and indeed Africa. But the fact of the matter is it has a consequence, and that consequence is that probably never before in the history, and dare I say within the United Nations context, has sovereignty become so increasingly rigid. And there's a globalization paradox here. And that is, while we talk about a far more globalized world, what is increasingly evident is it's more and more difficult to persuade governments to undertake the kinds of activities which a wider international system thinks are essential, particularly in humanitarian crises. Governments are far more reticent to assume that what the international community has to offer is what they need. And this is a tremendous challenge for the humanitarians and for those who, if you like, have to deal with the ecological and humanitarian mix. So you have, indeed, a resurgence of sovereignty. You also have, and I say this within the UN context, a far greater assumption that we cannot deal with 193 states to really get done what we think we need to do. So you have minilateralism more and more. If you like, agreements that do not come, that bears the imprimatur of the United Nations, but rather of local communities, local sectors, etc. And here too, I think, is something that needs to be taken into account as one begins to look at environmental emergencies. All this said, and this I think is core, because if you take a look at your last 2 days, and if I look back on what your panel said you covered yesterday and some of the notes that I've seen about what you did over this whole 2 days, I think you've got the right message. But let me suggest what you've also got to take a look at, and that goes back to your organization. What is fascinating is that basically I really wonder how speculative your organization is. How much you think and begin to anticipate about the what might be's. Oh, you might say, he's talking about prediction. No, I'm not. Because I don't think any of us can really say what's going to happen tomorrow, let alone in 10 or 20 years. But it's the attitude of an organization, its willingness to say, we are speculative. We are willing to anticipate the what might be's. That will determine whether you have the adaptive capacity to really engage and deal with the kind of issues, both environmentally and in terms of environmental crises, that you will have to deal with. Let me just dwell for a second on anticipation. Basically, I remember talking to a very large non-governmental organization, and I said the same thing. Your organization has to be more adaptive, more anticipatory. To which they said, we do. We have a policy unit that does that. And I said, but you're missing the whole point. Your human resources section, where are they in terms of anticipating crises? Where is your organization as a whole? Because the one lesson that we've picked up from organizations that are really of the 21st century is it's not a policy issue. It's an organizational issue. It is a sense of what our roles are and what we need to do. And it goes beyond a policy. It's an ethos. Does your organization have that speculative ethos? Oh no, you'll say. No, that's not really practical. Or yes, we do, but it's an add-on. And then we have to get back to our real work. Or it's a bit academic. And my answer to all of that is, no, it's not. It's an institutional choice you have to make. And that institutional choice is, am I, if you like, dealing with the day-to-day, or is my real function to try and get the wider international system through my organization to think about the what might be's, because there is my value added. And I think it was Rene who said something that I thought was deeply, deeply important, and that is the profound importance of information, and that information and the transfer of information was perhaps even more important than some of the transfer of what we consider vital survival resources. And I just thought that was really a very important point that fits into this. Adaption. How many of your organizations say, oh my God, we've got an executive committee meeting. It's the board meeting. It is, if you like, the General Assembly. It is ECOSOC, etc. And so we have to get a strategy together, and we get that strategy together, and there it is, and it's approved, and it then goes down to the bottom drawer of the filing cabinet. Because basically, strategies are not really seen all too often as guide marks for what we do. Because they're done, and now let's get on with the job. And what I'm suggesting is this. The organization of the 21st century will use a strategy, a longer-term strategy, to set its benchmarks, to say this is what we do, and on a regular basis review if the underlying assumptions, if the potential threats are really in one way or another being addressed. Does your organization do that? I also think that and I think you've touched on this, and that's this question of innovation. And I think it's really tremendously exciting. I wondered if you could go to your organization and say, how do we identify the types of organizations that the types of innovations that we might need? Innovative practices. Where do we get that source of information from? How do we know that basically this innovation might be needed? How do we identify it? And then, after this array of innovations, how do we actually begin to prioritize? Who does that in your organization? And how, if you like, is this then implemented? And how is it implemented with partners, for example, who don't have your capacities? So innovation is deeply important, but how do you do it? Is it just by happenstance? Or is it systematic? And that, to some extent, I think leads to this whole question of collaboration. Who are your partners? And I think, again, Rudy or someone up here mentioned it earlier. But let me just say, are your partners in the private sector? Are your partners, and now I say this, watching for every humanitarian to have a quick shudder, in the military? Do you deal with the diaspora on a regular and consistent basis? How will you deal with networks, hubs, social networked systems? How will you be collaborating? Let me give you one tremendously important example, which very few people and very few organizations think about. How do you dialogue with the sciences? Oh, we're a large organization. We have scientists and research scientists within our organization. Few can say that. What is the, if you like, consistent ways that you might dialogue? How do you dialogue, how do you translate science to communities? How do you take climate change and say, we can actually engage communities between the meteorological offices in Senegal and the meteorological office in Kenya with communities? And we can learn from those communities. But how do we dialogue? How do we collaborate with the sciences in your organization? Private sector. Well, they're the source of so much perhaps the kind of environmental pollution that we're all trying to fight against. Alternatively, let's turn this around. More and more private sector organizations realize that their very sustainability depends upon ensuring that the environment in which they work is effective, is durable. In a funny kind of way, it links into what humanitarians increasingly call resilience. How do we get the private sector to do this? Where do you start? The World Economic Forum? Or do you try and establish platforms in which the private sector, the research institutes, government authorities, etc., in West Africa, in the ASEAN nations, in Latin America, can actually talk, collaborate, and plan? Has that been tried? And the answer is all too rarely. Can we bring this down to a level in which it will work? Are you, as organizations, willing to do that? One of the key elements, I think, of collaboration, let me touch on this, is the military. And that's why one always gets the shudder. But the fact of the matter is, the military has probably one of the most extraordinary scientific capacities of any institutions around the world, particularly in the West. Do we draw upon that? Do we see that? If you talk about simultaneous crises, can we learn about the way the military deals with surge capacities? We're not talking about Helmand Province. What we're talking about is, can we learn about the way the military does strategy and long-term strategic thinking? And just by the way, if you're talking about innovations, and it's a grim analogy, but let me say it anyway, that if the military has a new weapon, most armies have to, if you like, adapt to that weapon in terms of 150,000, 200,000, 1 million soldiers within a relatively simultaneous time, bringing in and adapting to that innovation. What are your innovation practices? Is there anything that you could learn from the military? So the military, the private sector, all of these are key to your collaboration. Now, it's really interesting because if there's any consistent theme that comes up when it comes to UN and UN, if you like, problems identification, it's the question of leadership. And one always sort of sees this issue of leadership as someone on a white horse leading a charge over some, if you like, hill. But the real problem, and this is where the international community, for example, when it looks to the UN and says, where's the leadership, particularly in OCHA, where's the leadership in humanitarian crises? The answer is, leadership can only work if there's an enabling environment provided by the organization. To what extent is your organization sufficiently anticipatory to help, quote unquote, that leader begin to see what might be? To what extent does that leader begin to see what are the adaptive issues that we need to think about to make our organizations more sensitive to the environment in which we're operating? The collaborating partners, the learning, the innovation, all of that kind of thing depends upon your organization to have that capacity to be able to deal with the sorts of environmental crises that inevitably, but not necessarily predictably, will emerge. So leadership is less about that one individual and more about the enabling environment which that organization can provide. For without that, it's very difficult to be an effective leader, particularly given the kind of crises that we have to face. So, if I may, I thank you very much for your time. I look forward, if you ever had a moment individually or corporately, to see, is your organization fit for the future? Given the environmental crises that you spoke about, given their potential impact that I know that you're aware about, to what extent is your organization really able to deal with the what might be's and not just, if you like, what you've identified as the present? Thank you very much indeed. And I understand, Amy, that I'm allowed to be crucified by questions.
Absolutely.